Hello and welcome to the CNBC Africa special. I'm Kenneth Igbomo. I'll be coming to you live from the 2018 annual meetings of the African Development Bank, where we're looking at ways to chart a new course for industrialization in Africa. Joining me on this special will be the President of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina.
Well, it's great to be here in South Korea. And if you look at the history of the Korean, development, it's actually quite amazing. This is a country that, think about it, is smaller than Liberia, smaller than Benin. It's actually smaller than Mali. It's 1/3 of the size of a country like Algeria. And in fact, 32 countries are bigger than Korea. They were in the 1960s, the same, per capita GDP was maybe a little bit about $200 or so. Today, you take a look at them, per capita GDP, $26,000. And so how did they do it? They call it the miracle of the Han River. It wasn't really a miracle. It was the fact that they decided to industrialize. They industrialized, they started off with heavy industries. They went to light manufacturing. Then they moved up into a more high-tech, value-added industries. And today you have the Samsungs of the world. Everybody carries a Samsung. You look at the LG, televisions is all made here. You look at all the Hyundai, all the cars are made here. What did they do and how did they do it? I think first and foremost is the importance of long-term planning. The second thing I think is very important is to have very clear industrial policies that are implemented in a sustainable way. It's not start today and tomorrow then you don't know what you're doing, in a very, very sustainable way. The third is heavy investment in science and technology and innovations. And finally, I think, for me, the most important thing for them is the mindset matters. When you're really tired of being poor, when you say it's time for me to really develop and give myself wealth, then you're going to start industrializing. No other nation in the world, no nation, in fact, no single nation in the world has ever gotten out of poverty into wealth without industrializing. The Koreans decided they were going to do it, and they got it done. So the mindset and commitment, very critical.
I want to take you over that last point, and let's go deeper on that one. We're talking about the new thinking for African governments, for policymakers. How is the African Development Bank acting as a catalyst, to drive this new thinking?
Well, let me tell you why. If you take, for example, Africa as a continent, and as president of the African Development Bank, my mind always walks through this all the time, is that Africa is not a poor continent at all. But Africa just happens to have a lot of poor people. And so what we've got to do is, God has blessed this continent with a lot of natural resources. We've got great sunshine, we've got great agricultural lands. In fact, 65% of all the available arable land to feed 9 billion people in the world by 2050, it's not in Asia, it's not in Latin America or Europe, it's actually in Africa. We've got lots of oil, we have gas, we have minerals, we have metals. So we don't have any excuse to be poor. What we've got to do is to manage those resources well, is to industrialize that. And that's why the bank has actually launched a major strategy called Industrialize Africa. It's one of our high five priorities. And the key of that is we want to support countries to have very good industrial policies, helping them to actually invest a lot more in infrastructure that can enable industrial clusters and special economic zones to actually emerge. And third is also to make sure that we are supporting the development of capital markets, that you can mobilize savings pool, that can drive private sector investments. And most importantly is that as a bank, what's most important to us is not just the money. Knowledge matters. So that African countries can be exposed to why did it work, how did they do it in China, how did they do it in South Korea, how did they do it in Japan, how did they do it in Latin America, so that we can actually have the right knowledge products to help them learn from the best. Make sure you do what the best did, but don't make the mistakes of others. And that's what we are doing. And we're going to be investing in the area of industrializing Africa, a total of $35 billion over the next 10 years. It's roughly $3.5 billion a year. And our goal is very clear. We want to help this continent to raise its industrial GDP. Right now, it's roughly about in industrial GDP value, so roughly about $700 billion. We want to raise that to about $1.7 trillion by 2030. And there you will see a lot of jobs being created and so on. So it's not just about industries, though. It's about the fact that when you have industrial development, you create a lot of jobs, but a lot of quality, decent, well-paying jobs. And I think that's what you find in all these countries that have been able to do it, and that's what Africa must do.
Yeah, the knowledge economy is really, really important in driving this. And also looking at friendly environments for investments. It's very critical, needs to be done. But when you look at the knowledge economy and all the other aspects that, how do we protect people's intellectual property, for example? Because when you mentioned Samsung, they were able to do it because someone's intellectual property was protected. How does this sit in the whole industrialization strategy for the AfDB?
Yeah, one of the things that you find is if you're going to actually create clusters of innovation, you have to make sure that those that actually develop the innovations can have their patents. They can have intellectual property rights protection. And those are areas that are very, very important to drive creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship on the continent. So one of the big areas for us is how do we improve the business, investment, regulatory environment that allows private sector to thrive. And the second thing that's actually going to be very, very critical in trying to do this is what do we invest in? Because you cannot industrialize if you don't have the right productive capacity. And if you don't have the right human capital, in particular, the skills that are necessary for industrialization. Take a look at the world we live in today. You live in a world where artificial intelligence is going to rule, robotics is going to rule. You take a look at biotechnology, nanotechnology. These are all the things, quantum computing, these are the things that are going to dominate the world. And so I want us, from the African Development Bank, we are saying to ourselves, we've got to start investing in our young people, not for the jobs of the past, but for these jobs of the future. And that's why the bank is going to be investing heavily in helping to create about 230 computer coding centers that will allow young people to be able to get into the coding market globally. The bank also has invested quite a lot in helping to create industrial parks. For example, we put $200 million into helping to create industrial parks, digital parks, for example, ICT parks, in Cape Verde, in Senegal, and also we're doing that in Kenya and Rwanda. And so these are very, very important areas. So you need the knowledge, but you also need the enabling environment for that to thrive. But then you must have the supportive infrastructure for the entrepreneurs to be able to take off.
So when you look at the entire landscape of Africa, yes, some countries might have the political will. They want to industrialize. They really, really want to. They know they need it like yesterday, but they don't have the capacity. So how can we do this and not leave any country behind?
Well, if you take a look at the case of Africa, one area that I think we need to make sure that we are not normalizing is the fact that many African countries are actually deindustrializing. They are not even industrializing, And so some of them are losing a big share of their industrial output. Big ones that have been actually shedding quite a lot in terms of the industrial value added between 2010 and 2017, are there. You look at Egypt, you look at, since 2005 rather, to 2017, you take a look at Egypt, you take a look at Nigeria, you take a look at Algeria, you look at South Africa, their industrial value added has actually been declining. As a continent, during that period of time, the continent shrunk its industrial value added by $72 billion. Yet you have some that are actually showing great examples, such as Morocco, and you look at, because they are big in aeronautic engineering, you take a look, for example, at Rwanda, Ethiopia, and so on. And so, yes, we don't want to leave anybody behind, but it means that everybody must do the right things. And the right things will mean have a clear development plan, industrial development strategy, be very meticulous in executing it, support the private sector, support entrepreneurship, support small and medium-sized businesses. Because when you industrialize, you actually create a lot of jobs through small and medium-sized enterprises. And to make sure that nobody's left behind, we also have to mobilize our own capital ourselves, because every country has huge amount of domestic resources. The issue is how we mobilize it, how we channel it, and how we use it. And that's what made Korea so different. You may not know this, and many people may not even know this, that Samsung, that we're all talking about today and we all carry it around, Samsung in the past, in the 1960s, what they were exporting? They were exporting human hair. The Korean women actually cut off their hair and they gave it off for them to be able to export it. It tells you what determination, focus can be. They started with exporting human hair. Today, they dominate the digital economy. Why can African countries do that?
Okay, so I'd like to look. Yes, we know that there's low-hanging fruits here and there when when you're talking about industrializing. But I'd like to look beyond that. We're starting from a low base. How can we create a more sustainable industrialization policy for Africa?
Well, first is we've got to first look at ourselves in the mirror. I like that song by Michael Jackson that says, "I'm talking about the man that's in the mirror, and I'm asking him to change his ways." If we are deindustrializing when we should be accelerating industrialization, then we've got to take a look at ourselves in the mirror and ask ourselves why. First and foremost is we've got to change the infrastructure deficit situation on the continent. Not acceptable. Because how do you industrialize if you have no power? How do you industrialize if you have no good logistic base to be able to get your things to port and out, and therefore be more competitive? So closing Africa's infrastructure gap is one of the things that we must absolutely do and do very, very fast. And secondly is that we also have to make sure that we can direct government policies to industries that can allow Africa to win. If you take a look at the way things are right now, if you take a look at the service industry, I am excited about, the media, in Africa. You see the Nollywood is doing very, very well. You see digital financial services. You see a lot of young people that are doing that. Today we had a session here. I said young people that are doing, great companies with artificial intelligence and all of that. We need to have special financing vehicles that allows young people, that will allow young people in Africa to turn their business ideas into great global businesses. There's no reason why they can't do that. Somebody had to put a bet on somebody like Mark Zuckerberg. Somebody had to take a bet on somebody like Bill Gates. So in Africa, what we've got to do is find our entrepreneurs and set up financing vehicles that allows them to have access to equity finance and also private venture capital funds that can allow their businesses to thrive. I want Africa to have its own Silicon Valley, where young people can dominate the world, with their own IT businesses. These are the things that I think needs to really change. As I look in the mirror, this is what Africa needs to change, and many more.
That was the president of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina. We'll continue our discussions right after the break. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is the CNBC Africa special coming to you straight from Busan in South Korea, and we've been speaking to the president of the African Development Bank about ways to industrialize Africa. So looking at the entire landscape across Africa right now, we're seeing these are very interesting times. We're seeing the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement being signed, needs to be ratified. We're seeing the single air transport market coming up. We're seeing ECOWAS meeting later this month to talk about a single currency, where the African Union on the other hand is also trying to build a high-speed railway. Looking at all these developments happening, and the African Development Bank also coming up with the African Investment Forum much later in the year, looking at how the landscape is changing, how do you think this will impact industrialization for the continent?
Well, I think the critical thing for industrializing the continent is that we all agree that we must close Africa's infrastructure gap. And that's why for us at the African Development Bank, I can't think of anything more important than to close that gap. It's roughly about anything between $68 billion and $108 billion every year. I'm very excited about our changing the landscape on that. We created something called a private equity vehicle called Africa 50. Actually, I'm chairman of the Africa 50. The African Development Bank created it. Right now, it's mobilized about $863 million, and we're hoping to grow it to about $3 billion to help to develop projects. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have bankable projects, you are not going to be able to move fast on industrialization. So that's changing the landscape on that. The other thing that I think it's also very important as a game changer is the continental free trade area that you mentioned. I'm really thrilled that all the borders have to come down in Africa. Look, we need economies of scale. When somebody wants to invest in a business, they shouldn't just be investing in a cement business in one small country. Why can't you invest all across many countries at the same time? So I think the continental free trade area, when fully signed by everybody, is going to be a big game changer for Africa. So we must encourage a lot more intra-Africa trade, very, very much so. I think the other thing that I think is going to be very important is just changing our own approach. Why is it, for example, that Africa today accounts for 65 and 75% of the global production of cocoa, but we only account for 2% of the chocolate market, which is $120 billion a year. Africa produces today about 50% of the total global supply of gold. And if you look at the value of that they process annually, over $300 billion, we don't even make money out of those things. So what I'm saying is that we need industries that will process everything for us, whether it's minerals, oil, gas, or agricultural products. These are the things that will allow us to probably enter into global value chains or even regional value chains that will take advantage of the continental free trade area. And one big issue that we have to also make sure is that we must market Africa better. Take a look at it today. China. China has moved up on its value chain, industrial value chain, and it has left the whole issue of labor-intensive manufacturing businesses. Now that means that today China can externalize roughly 100 million jobs out of those industries that it has moved out of to other parts of the world. Well, those jobs should be coming to Africa. But the question is, what's Africa's readiness index? Are we ready for that? You still need to invest in power, in infrastructure, in logistics, business and investment environment. Those are the things that are driving us as a bank when we created the launched the Africa Investment Forum to change the business investment regulatory environment, to bring great projects to the table on infrastructure in particular, and to de-risk investments of businesses that are landing on the continent. These are some of the trends that are happening, but I think at the end of the day, Africa really itself has to enter the global market and industrialize through value chains on commodities that it has comparative advantage in.
So let's look at strategies. You touched on briefly on some of your strategies earlier when you talked about the capital markets and what you're trying to do in there. But I want us to look at, how you're trying to attract and channel funding for infrastructure.
Well, if you take a look at infrastructure, just in terms of funding, actually, you see that there is essentially an asymmetry in the location of capital. So capital is there, but it's sitting out there outside of Africa. In fact, Africa's own sovereign wealth funds are actually investing all their monies outside of Africa, not in Africa. So I don't see many of them as sovereign wealth funds for Africa. I see them as, sovereign wealth funds for others. And so I think that these pools of money, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and other insurance pool of funds are critical. And we must leverage that to support infrastructure on the continent. When I take a look at the size of that in Africa, the sovereign wealth funds and all these pension funds, take them together. There will be about $1.8 trillion by about 2020, 2025. And so this is actually quite a lot of money that can be channeled into infrastructure. The second area where we have to also deal with is all the global pension funds. They're investing their money in money market instruments that are, in most cases, giving them low or negative real rate of return. But the infrastructure project of rail, of ports, and transnational highways and stuff like that are in Africa, or energy. But we want them to be investing in Africa. That's why the Africa Investment Forum that I mentioned was created. Because at the end of the day, they want to invest. They will say, but the risk. Well, what's the big deal with risk? The issue is to de-risk the risk. And you reduce your risk and you maximize on your upside return. And so the Africa Investment Forum that we have created brings together a very powerful global force of actors. The African Development Bank, the World Bank, the International Finance Corporation, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Islamic Development Bank, the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. This is the first time that all of us have gotten together on one platform. What that means is that when investors are coming to Africa, we want them to have their projects or areas they want to invest in de-risked. You reduce the risk of their investment collectively. And this is very, very important to be able to leverage capital markets to work for Africa's industrialization and closing its infrastructure gap.
So, but let's look at the size of funding needed now, and the consistency of the funding. How can we ensure that this is available?
Well, the amount of money that Africa needs for its industrialization is quite a lot. But from our side, as a bank, we are going to be investing significantly about, as I said, $35 billion over the next 10 years to support this and to help to leverage about $56 billion into this particular area. But that's not enough. We still need other pools of funds to come in. And some of the other areas that I think we need to close is the energy sector financing and so on. When you put it all together, anyway, as I said, it comes down to roughly about $68 to $108 billion just to close those infrastructure gaps that are going to be preconditions for industrialization to occur. But I'm not scared of the big monies. I think Africa has the investment possibilities. I think the projects are there. I think the natural resources are there. What we've got to do is to create instruments that allow people to invest smartly in Africa. And I think we're on our way to doing that.
So where should this funding be going to? What sectors should it be going to? What industries should it be going to? What locations should it be going to?
Well, first and foremost, if you look at the sectors, there are a number of exciting sectors in Africa. You take agriculture, for example. Agriculture, Africa literally can feed the world. In fact, it has to, because 65% of all the arable land left in the world is actually that's not cultivated, it's in Africa. And so agriculture and agribusiness, and taking agriculture as a business, is a very critical thing. I think that the service industry is one in which you see a lot of potential. The ICT sector, where we see a lot of young people going into, it's very, very important. But I also take a look at the oil and gas. We shouldn't forget oil and gas. If you take a country like in Mozambique, Mozambique has 180, trillion cubic feet of gas. That is the largest in the world. How do you unlock something like that? You have the same also in Tanzania. You find that Nigeria also has that. And so how do we turn this into real wealth streams for Africa is a big deal. Now, other sectors, such as the mining sector, is one in which we have to also invest significant amount of money. So the opportunities are literally limitless. But I think that those are the things that I would say. But in terms of location, I think capital goes to the location where capital is comfortable. And so the countries that are doing the right things, managing their macroeconomic environment better, making sure that they provide the right kind of fiscal incentives that will attract the private sector, and where there is political will to drive development and to support private sector growth, that's where the money is going to be. You cannot really direct capital. Capital chooses where it goes. And where the environment is right and where the environment is supported, capital always stays there.
So now let's look at models. The public private sector participation with the government and all that, the PPPs. What models would you recommend for African governments going forward?
Well, it's very hard to give a cookie cutter model for all of African countries because they are very, very diverse, right? So you cannot do that. But there are certain principles and certain lessons that one can learn from the experiences of those that have industrialized very well. If you remember, in the 80s, everything was all about structural adjustment. Well, structural adjustment is one of the reasons actually why Africa today deindustrialized. Because what it did was it told African governments to get out of everything. So the institutions, the state institutions that you needed to support and to direct the path of development were dismantled. That doesn't mean the government should be doing everything, but you clearly need the institutions to direct development. And if you take a look at the rest of the world, take a look at it, whether it's in South Korea or whether it's in Singapore or whether it's in Malaysia or whether it's in Japan or China, the state plays a very, very important role. So I would say that the state really needs to step up. Access to land is critical. Good regulatory environment is very, very important. Channeling finance to the sectors that you really want to drive is very, very critical. Some people say, well, don't pick winners. Well, who wants to pick losers? Pick the sectors in which you have comparative advantages and direct the money there and grow those particular sectors. I think that's key. The second one is that where you find a lot more success is when the government actually support the private sector. So to your point, of public-private partnerships are going to be very, very important. Now, if you take, for example, the case of Ethiopia, Ethiopia's industrial value added grew by 500% between 2012 and 2018. What made it different? Ethiopia invested heavily in creating industrial parks, special economic zones, and enabled them with infrastructure. It has a development bank of Ethiopia that supported its work on floriculture. They become now the fifth largest exporter of flowers in the world. And now they've also worked together with Chinese companies to now be making, shoes. And they're the largest producer of that right now in Africa. And also into cotton, textile, and garment industry. So the point really is that African countries have to find the right balance in terms of public support, but also creating private sector entrepreneurship. I think that works. And at the end of the day, if you do all those things and you have the right policy and investment environment, I think African economies can really industrialize fast. But we don't have that much time. We have to do it quickly.
So finally, what's the one thing you would want anybody coming to these meetings to take away?
Well, first is that recognize that your size doesn't matter. Your natural resources don't matter. What matters is your creativity, your determination, and your drive to get your people out of poverty through industrialization. If Korea, as small as Korea is able to do that, I don't see why Africa can't do that, and I don't see why every single African country can't do that. It's time for us to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, let's change our ways now.
And that was the president of the African Development Bank, Akinwumi Adesina. And this brings us to the end of our special broadcast. And as they say in South Korea, annyeong, which means goodbye.